18 months. Now, here's some of the challenges for Canada. First of all, we're now a petroloonie, we're a petrocurrency, and our forecast is that the dollar will remain a strong currency from here to the horizon. Look at the correlation here between the dollar, which is the purple bar, and the oil price. And our assumption for oil prices, and it's an assumption, is that normal price of oil now I think is about $80 a barrel, maybe heading towards say 100 by 2012. I have to put an assumption into our model to actually spit out the forecast. So that's my assumption. You can see the correlation. Well, that means a strong currency. So anybody in the room who's betting on the dollar going back to 80 cents as its way to stay competitive is going to lose their bet. You have to now start planning for a world where the dollar is more or less at par as fundamentals, which means as an exporter you're going to be challenged. As an importer, that's pretty good news. It means you can import technology from Europe or for the United States at a much better price. And of course, as consumers, we can all go to Florida and buy those cheap properties with the dollar more or less at par. But that's a really important planning assumption for you in Eastern Ontario and for people across the country. The days of relying upon a cheap currency are gone. We now have to become, like Norway and Switzerland, frankly, strong currency countries that are going to have to learn how to adapt. So the word innovation, you know, you're going to see a lot of that. You heard it from Ian this morning. We have to become an innovation-led economy as we deal with a strong currency. And unfortunately, there's other challenges coming too. Interest rates are only going up. We've already seen the bank raise rates by 25 basis points. Mark Carney bought himself a bit of space because there is a lot of churn out there. But our forecast is rates will rise by, say, as much as 150 basis points, 1.5% by the end of the year. Maybe not quite that fast, but over the next 18 months, we think rates will rise towards about 4% at the short end. And that'll be reflected in borrowing costs for individuals, in your personal line of credit, in your mortgage, and for business financing as well. So now's the time, if you're thinking about refinancing, you will not get a better price than today. You have to think about that on a going forward basis. So that's a big challenge. It's going to take a lot of cash out of our pockets and give it to the bankers because the interest rate environment is going to be going up. Challenge number 3 for firms. I think because we're going to have a tight labor market by about 2012 again, you're going to see chronic upward pressure on wages. And this is our forecast going forward for both inflation, the yellow line, and for average weekly wages, the little purple bar. And you can see the bar goes above the inflation line for the next 2 years. And in fact, going forward, the gap actually widens. We're now entering a period where we're shifting from a labor surplus economy to a labor shortage economy. And everybody's going to feel that. You are going to have to work a lot harder, for example, to get immigrants coming to Eastern Ontario, leaving Mississauga, living on the other side of Toronto, and then coming further east, because your firms are going to be challenged to find the workforce that you need going forward. I think we have kind of a 2-year window before we're back to full employment. But that's an important symptom, looking at the wage bill rising. So you combine that with a strong dollar, that means that investment in technology, innovation within your firm is really going to become important to raise your productivity so you can pay those wages, as well as the taxes you're going to have to pay down the road. So there's a picture of what's happened to unemployment going back 2 recessions, and you can see, to reinforce that story, how the slope is downward. Even at the worst, you know, this recession we saw unemployment jump from around 6% nationally up to 8.5%. We're now sliding down. It's down to 8.1 nationally, and I'll show you the detail for the provinces. We think Canada will be back to full employment by about the end of 2012. And from then on, we're going to have to deal with that ongoing challenge of a chronically aging workforce. I've got a paper coming out in a magazine called Policy Options next month that explores this in more detail and also talks about how our immigration policy should be fine-tuned to ensure that we're capturing our fair share of immigrants to fill whatever holes we have in our workforce and keep revitalizing the national economy. So it'll be online, I think, sometime in mid-July. The thing that had the biggest impact during the recession was business investment. The floor fell out. Obviously, manufacturing was very hard hit, autos, but lots of other sectors. It also happened in the oil sands and throughout the service economy. So the pain was pretty widely shared. Investments coming back, but very slowly. We got the latest numbers from StatsCan for the first quarter this year, which showed that machinery and equipment investment, which I call investment-led investment, grew but at a fairly slow rate, sort of 1.5% annualized, and plant is continuing to contract still. So our view on investment going forward is that the return to normal is going to take a bit of time. We're showing growth of sort of 8 to 9%, 2011. So that's one of the lagging edges, and that's of course why our government stepped up. and really have done investment in infrastructure in a very big way. We have both a combination of a catch-up period because Canada systematically underinvested in our public infrastructure for about 25 years. You can see that in our cities, you can see that in our transportation system at the border. So we were already catching up. Ontario and many other provincial governments had growing budgets for infrastructure investment. Then the recession hits, the feds top up their spending, and provinces are challenged to keep up. So this is now the leading edge of our economy. Public sector spending on infrastructure is why we're growing right now. That was arguably the best form of stimulus. We've done work for Ontario, for example, showing what the positive payback is. For every dollar invested in infrastructure, you're getting $1.50 or more in terms of stimulus. So it's a good use of spending going forward. And that's going to be a chronic need as we really fight to try and keep our economy competitive. So all the stimulus that happened in Canada has come at a price. And here's a chart that's a little bit busy, but the purple bars are federal, the yellow bars are provinces together. You know, we were in a really sweet spot amongst governments almost anywhere in the world. We were paying down debt. Debt ratios were improving for everybody. The Fed, for example, had fallen from 70% of GDP, debt GDP, down to 30%. And that's part of the reason why we could afford to do the stimulus in a way that others couldn't. But it's come at a price. You know, we're now spending about $100 billion in deficit when you add up the feds and all the provinces this year. And the challenge is, will we have a plan to get back to balance? And I think the federal government's actually ahead of plan. Their year-end deficit was $47 billion. Sounds like a big number, but they were planning for 53. And 3 months before that, they were planning for 58. So they're well ahead, in part because we're growing as an economy, so their tax revenues are going up, and in part because we have a bit of inflation, which in this part of the cycle is not a bad thing. Most provinces also have a pretty detailed plan for how they're getting back to balance. I don't know how much you looked at the Quebec budget when it came out, but Quebec put in place a really tough budget. They're well aware of the demographic time bomb that's ticking right now. Quebec's getting old very fast, so they put in place a plan to get back to balance by 2014, and it was a tough plan. They've increased their provincial sales tax by 2 percentage points for the next 2 years. They've introduced user fees on health care. They've scaled back spending, so they're going to get back to balance. The challenge is going to be Ontario. Ontario now has a deficit of about $20 billion. Hopefully it'll be a little bit better based upon what the feds have done. But Mr. Duncan's budget actually only had a plan to get back to balance in 2018. And I don't think that's good enough, but I also understand why, in part because of politics. We have an election next year, but also because Ontario was in a deep hole, and it was too early to start talking about fiscal adjustment quite yet. But you know, once the election's over, frankly, we're going to have a serious debate in this province about what sustainable fiscal policy looks like. So overall, wrap all that together for the national economy, we're looking at a really good growth year, in fact, compared to what could have been. Growth of around 3.5%, maybe even a little bit better, which is in line with the numbers that the Bank of Canada and Federal Department of Finance have just put out. And then a little bit slower growth going forward as we start to see the withdrawal of fiscal stimulus and as your average Canadian has to save. So that's the Canadian story. I'm just going to scoot on now and talk a little bit about all the provinces and then finish with Ontario and what it means for all of you in Eastern Ontario. So the story across the country is a little bit uneven. Unfortunately, the West is best, although Ontario sneaks up there in terms of growth rates for the next 2 years. Quebec is going through adjustment. Finally, Ontario is outperforming the national average. Maybe I'll just go on and show you what it looks like broken down by province, and I won't go down this in detail. But look at the top 4. You get 3 Western provinces, and Ontario sneaking in there, in part because Ontario suffered more during the recession than almost anybody else, and therefore we would expect to bounce back, and that's happening. You're starting to get positive growth numbers in the auto sector and housing starts in a lot of parts of the economy. And same sort of story into 2011, where Ontario is actually one of the better performers. So that's a pretty good starting point. We won't talk about where Newfoundland and Manitoba are. That's a good starting point. But there are challenges, and they're quite clear for the province. We don't do a detailed breakdown by region across the province, so I can't give you an Eastern Ontario forecast, but I think the Ontario forecast we have is a pretty good proxy. You know, we take Windsor out of the equation, some of the communities that are really hard hit, maybe some of the northern communities as well. I think Eastern Ontario probably is fairly well aligned with our Ontario forecast. So, one, we're recovering. Good news. The auto sector is healing, but we're a long way from normal. I think Ian mentioned the fact that auto sales in North America used to be 17 million. During the recession, we went from 17 to 9, cut in half. And that's why, you saw the crisis in 2 of the 3 companies, you saw layoffs, you saw all the bad news. But I heard this morning on Canada AM, in fact, that some of the auto companies and the parts companies are starting to hire people back. So there is a lot of anecdotal evidence of the healing going on. Private investment sluggish, so government had to step up and spend the money. But the big challenge is the public accounts, the really popular harmonized sales tax. I must confess that I did a brief 3 years ago that my friend Steve Orsini at Ontario Finance keeps citing as a reason why we should have a harmonized sales tax, so I hope you saved all your buns and can throw them now. I think Ontario Finance in particular has done a really good job under this government to bring about the tax reform the province needed. It's tough. We're all going to have to swallow that, but cutting corporate income tax rates, getting rid of the capital tax, bringing about sales tax harmonization, I think is really critical for manufacturers in particular, but really for the whole economy. If Ontario is going to have any chance of success with the U.S. market in such tough shape with the dollar at par, with an aging workforce. So those are the kind of courageous things that governments have to do in tough times to make sure that the province stays competitive. And obviously that applies as readily here as it would in Windsor or